as we speak. I definitely think there is some kind of sizable and serious material change that is not only underway, but that is going to become even more stark very soon. And, being somebody who believes in the importance of remaining optimistic, even as the facts, are often very sobering, if only because I think that that's also important for resistance and for dissent. I think if we give in to despair completely to a certain extent, we're also doing the work of the oppressors, right? So I think we do need to kind of remind ourselves that, we need to continue to see possibility. So on that level, I do very much hope that there can be something that is truly collectivist, truly liberationist, that meets the current counter-revolution that we are being subjected to. But I think it's really a combination of time as well as the significance of resistance efforts, that is really going to flesh out the picture for us.
Yeah, I agree. I've talked about this a lot. I think people, when they hear the term revolution, they think, oh, that's violent. Mm-hmm. Well, it inevitably ends up that way, but the revolution itself is not inherently violent. The revolution is actually happening right now. We're seeing it all over the world happening right now. We're in it. It's not necessarily going to look like what we perceive in this country, the revolutionary war. Well, the war aspect comes at the end of that revolution. So that's sort of the direction we're going. And as far as the level of violence, as far as I'm concerned, and I've said it many times, the level of violence is determined by the oppressor. So the level of acceptable violence in our society is determined by the oppressor. And I'd say they're pretty freaking violent. Mm-hmm. So unfortunately, that's where we are. And one thing I wanted to ask you about, like, while we're seeing this complete imposition of, digital apartheid or digital colonialism, if you want, first you can distinguish those two, but what are some of the things that Palestinian content creators, journalists, voices have been doing to circumnavigate what is going on with this level of suppression? Because again, this has been going on prior to, October 23.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, it's, I think, unfortunately, one of the kind of dangers that comes with the terrain of being, digitally active is that, for better and for worse, this over censoriousness of these platforms, or what I think of as this anti-Palestinian content moderation, has just become so normalized, right? The platforms basically instituted as policy at this point. And, individual users know that that's basically what they're going to be experiencing, right? And they know that they have very little recourse. Sometimes getting into some options people have, which are very limited, if you're going to go the route of trying to petition to have, an account reinstated or a post unblocked or uncensored, right? There are mechanisms for doing that. For example, via Meta, you can say that this post was wrongfully, taken down. And then it's a question of, are they going to, approve that or not, right? Are they going to agree with you or not? And, so either they don't and it stays down, or they do. But even when they do, people I've talked to have said that, the reach is already kind of throttled at that point. So even if it kind of comes back, the reach is throttled and you've sort of missed the moment, because one of the significant aspects of social media is, of course, how immediate it is. You can respond to things in the moment. You can provide a commentary of things as they're unfolding in real time. So suppression or censorship or deletion, stops your ability to do that. So even if you get something back, if you were talking about something that happened 5 days ago, by the time you get it back, at this point, the function of it has already basically been eclipsed, right?
Right.
And then there's also, with the increasing aggressiveness of all forms of moderation, including this AI facilitated content moderation, a lot of terms are flagged. So what some content creators have started doing is using what is referred to as algo speak. So they'll kind of misspell words cleverly, or they'll use emojis, like the skull instead of, killed or died, right? Things like that. And to a certain extent, that bypasses some censorship. Then, of course, people have just also internalized the way that the algorithms work in terms of what they show to their audience. So I talked to content creators with very large audiences who would say, I noticed that I am so shadow banned. And of course, companies don't even admit they engage in shadow banning. It's just something users are able to kind of, connect the dots about. They say, I noticed that I'm shadow banned because I have such a huge audience and maybe only 100 or so people are seeing these posts about Palestine. I realized that then, I needed to kind of switch up my feed. So then maybe I have a personal post, or maybe I post, an unrelated photo, things that make the algorithm more likely to show it to, my broader base of followers. And of course, but that's also an issue because you need to start kind of catering your creativity and your time and your energy to kind of, extra work that, just to be able to actually do the main messaging that you really started the account to engage in the first place, which is talk about Palestinian rights, talk about the genocide, talk about military occupation, so on and so forth. So, there are some recourses that creators have, but it is not that much. And even, as we have really great organizations like Hamla, for example, the Palestinian Digital Rights Organization, and set of social, orgs that are doing really important work and really important documentations of all of these violations of digital rights. The issue we have is that these companies, given their private status, really are able to act with this impunity regarding what they censor and what they choose to allow to stay up. And, it's no accident that things that are tied to the liberation of an indigenous people are not on that list of speech that they think should be protected. In fact, it's the opposite. It's speech that should be throttled. It should be disappeared. It should be erased.
Well, we just went through that a couple of days ago because I've been saying for the longest time that they do want to shut us down. They have to have some type of an angle to do it. They can't make it too obvious. But we got our second copyright strike, and it was from a clip from last year's Super Bowl. And of course, what was the clip? It was the clip of the backup dancer during the halftime show showing the Palestinian flag.
Mm-hmm.
So we were able to track down who got us the copyright strike. And we asked them, what is it going to take for you to consider removing the strike? 500 euros. Or we could talk about a partnership. So it's extortion on top of everything else. This is all about money. This is all about power. There is no justification behind it. If there was any indication that supporting the Palestinian cause was better for content creators, better for grifters, they would all jump on it like white on rice, like they do what just happened in Minneapolis. Again, it's all about the money. So everyone will be in line with what's going on until eventually it's just not feasible to do it anymore. And so I'm thinking, is it ultimately going to come to pass where enough people realize that Israel is the bane on our existence? They are a huge part, the whole construct of the Zionist state is a huge part of why our republic is collapsing under its own weight. You got Trump coming out saying, we totally need to have 1.5 trillion for our military budget now. And there are people that will go out and say, that's a great idea. Hey, we should have more money for the military. It's what it is. And as you like to say, Jen, pigs get fat and hogs get slaughtered. And if we're not in the hog stage, and I don't know what the hell stage we're in, I don't even think we're in the hog stage. I feel like we're in the elephant stage at this point. At what point does it just burst at the seams? Because I think everybody at this point is kind of looking around thinking, all right, what are we waiting for now? What are we waiting for at this point? Because they're daring us to do something.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And I think we're at a point where, just the broader public perception, of the Israeli state, of the Israeli project is pretty abysmal for the most part. Of course, you're always going to have, the particular demographics that, remain supporters. You're going to have the political organizations and causes that, just by nature of their ideology will always be diehard supporters. But I think in terms of the broader public, I do believe we're at a point where there is a sea change in terms of people's perception of the Israeli state. And I do think we're also seeing increasing emphasis on how support for the Israeli project in many ways is ostensibly counter to our ultimate interests. Now, I want to be clear that I'm not saying that that's the case for the political elites, and that's not the case, for the project of empire, because Israel is actually a great gift for those things. But I do think if we're talking about kind of, ordinary individuals, right, I think people are aware that there is something very nonsensical about throwing all these resources, all this money into this colonial apartheid project, whose viciousness and violence is on full display and has been on full display for years, even with all of this censorship, right? And so, but I think we're also at an interesting moment where the writing is on the wall, and the elites are aware that the writing is on the wall, but they also, have this kind of impunity to where they don't feel the need to really cater to the kind of popular interest at this point. And so it is, as you're saying, I think, what is going to happen next? They made it clear that they don't care. People are outraged in general, right? And outraged about many things, but there's starting to be more questioning of the support for this project that has long been, a pillar of U.S., foreign policy. So what's going to happen now? How many more letters, how many more protests, how many more messages do you really need, right? But I think we're at this moment where you have, to a certain extent, it seems to me kind of a breakdown in hegemony. There is less of an effort, let's say, to manufacture consent, right? That I think there has been since, for recent years that I can recall, at least, right? And it seems as though people are really not buying it or not having it anymore for a large part. Again, aside from the particular political organizations or ideological projects for whom it is most beneficial to continue to support this. But I think we have a bigger shift in terms of people kind of rejecting this. And the question is, what's going to happen now? Because the elites have made it clear that they really don't care about that, right? And there's been countless, attempts, to kind of raise the stakes in dissent, and, really people from kind of all channels, have basically issued some kind of a decree or of dissent on some level, right? Whether they're, former state officials or whether they're, people who are not necessarily on our side, even in terms of having, a good, strong anti-imperialist politics. Even people who are products of the system itself have come out, have, sort of resigned over the years. And it's been very clear that this is going to continue to be maintained.
Well, because they're concerned, because they know that the walls are closing in on them too. And this is why you see the type of rhetoric that gets spewed all the time. And I feel that a good place to wind down the conversation is what just happened recently in Minneapolis. Again, Minneapolis, for some reason, is becoming the eye of the hurricane. But with that being said, the whole Somali fraud story and the whole boosting of Nick Shirley by Elon and a whole bunch of others, that kind of got sniffed out very, very quickly. A lot of people were thinking, okay, something's not adding up here. Something doesn't smell right. And while there are going to be those that just bow at the altar of MAGA or whatever you want to call it, because I do believe there is a clear-cut distinction between MAGA and America First in terms of the movement splits that are happening right now, at least in terms of conservative America. I would say that it is clear as day that the connection between what the Zionist state wants to do in Israel is the same in terms of what they're trying to accomplish here. And this is a clip, Jen, that you had sent me regarding how the Mossad was behind basically the entire thing. And people are now starting to pick up on this fact.
Israeli Mossad related to the recent corruption that was discovered in Minnesota. You're not going to believe it, but there actually is a substantial connection, and it runs through the Israeli Prime Minister office. I'll start from the end. Israel just established relationships with Somaliland, which is not Somalia. But the backstory to the whole Minnesota corruption story is that much of those funds, and again, I think the initial number that came out is about $9 billion. And again, this is crazy. Money of, let's say, 15 billion that they imagine were stolen or misdiverted from public funds. About 9 billion of those were sent back to support terrorism, or what they would call the Muslim Brotherhood actions, and this is tied into Qatar. And Israel, of course, was behind the scenes, and I know people love these conspiracies, in leaking some of the information that is responsible or related to the funding of terrorism using that exact money. So
I also want to just point out the absurdity of Somaliland. We need another Somalia that we can send the Palestinians to, or there's going to be a training ground, weapons testing ground. I just want to know who around the world thinks that this is normal discourse, because it doesn't seem normal to me at all. And the fact that the Mossad or Israeli intelligence is behind all of these clandestine operations that become more and more obvious on the surface, I do think we're heading a kind of revolutionary moment because they're not able to fool people the way that they used to. As Lincoln always said, you can fool some of the people all the time. You can fool all the people some of the time. You can't fool all of the people all of the time. And I feel that we're at that point now.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's even interesting to kind of compare this moment to the immediate sort of post 9/11 moment. I mean, I think a lot of the discourse that, to me, it seemed that had kind of more of a leverage in terms of, mobilizing the manufacture of consent, all of these things. I really think that at this point, people can see through all of this. And so you're really not able to kind of latch on to the same tropes, to use the same rhetoric in terms of criminalization, to just rely on the dehumanization of entire groups of people as an actual political argument, that resonates with people in the way that you were able to say in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, or prior to that. But again, I do think that given the fact that there is kind of this breakdown in the ability to manufacture consent, I think on the one hand, it's a good thing that people can see through it, but I think it should also kind of give us some pause, because the fact that that project is not working as effectively as it is anymore, the fact that hegemony is just that laid bare for all to see and is much more visible now than it ever was, means that there's could also be other tools in the arsenal, to use, if you will, right, to kind of continue to ensure that these projects, and these operations go undisturbed. So it is a question of thinking of, okay, what's next, and how do we continue to resist, and how do we continue to really reflect the interconnection of all of our struggles in terms of what we fight for, right? Collective freedom and liberation for all people, and a complete rejection of the impunity, with which these agencies and which these armed forces and have continued to act, right, presently and historically.
Yeah, and it's absurd because we've been seeing, it just makes us really see how often we've been propagandized and for how long, and the fact that now we're just able to see it so clearly and it's being called out. But I second guess everything. I don't believe any of it. But we had said that Israel recognizing Somaliland, Peter says it's like Narnia recognizing Atlantis.
It's all just made up stuff, and we'll finish it out. But this really does crystallize what I've been feeling, which is there's something really wrong here, and the average person is starting to feel the same way.
The fact that Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu has a phone call and recognizes Somaliland is tied into Qatar being a supporter of the Muslim Brotherhood, tied into the Somali funds that were stolen in Minnesota funding terrorism in the Middle East. That is a story that came out right now. It really blows my mind how global terrorism works, but it's such an amazing thing that it was uncovered, and I'm sure there's more news to come on this topic.
I feel like all filthy roads lead to Zio hell.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that for many of us who've been doing this work for years, it's felt like you've had to expend a good deal of, energy and time to kind of show how the premise, of what kind of defense people would make for Zionism or for the Israeli state project, how it actually, there isn't much substance kind of like subtending it, right? And I think that we're at a moment where it's very clear that, this is a lot more patent than it has ever been before. And we see that, what the rhetoric that Israelis often want to use is very contradictory to the actual reality of what it is doing, right? And part of it too, I think, is we're kind of living through this destabilization of this kind of mystique of, expertise that I think the kind of culture at large had often imputed to Israel, right? Like this kind of savvy tech bastion or, this counter-terrorist bastion, right? We're realizing that actually it's, really nothing more than brutality and conquest that has always really defined its major efforts. And it was so normalized precisely because, that violence was very conducive to the US's own imperialist interests, right? But now we're kind of seeing the the fall of the kind of cultural cachet that I think the Israeli state has enjoyed in broader culture for so long. So, what do you do with that when you start to have, more and more receipts that kind of show that to be so, precisely also because we're in a cultural moment where people are starting to be skeptical and more people are starting to be skeptical. So more people are starting to piece everything together. So I think, we're going to continue to see this kind of decline. And I think we're going to continue to see more and more information come out about how really inimical the Zionist project is and always has been. And the question is, again, what is going to happen with all of those receipts, right? What are they going to translate to? What are they going to lead to? Part of the project that I have been doing is precisely to see what happens when, that the variability to put that information to use is silenced, right? We're going to see a lot more silencing for sure. But the fact that I think a lot more people are primed and paying attention is important. And it means that there's going to be no shortage of attempts to continue to kind of bring the necessary information to the fore.